the Ball State Library of Explication Tapes. The following discussion of literature is one of a series made possible through a Lilly Endowment grant. The award was made by the Committee on Foundation Grants of the Association of College and Research Libraries, a division of the American Library Association. These grants are for the purpose of promoting more extensive and imaginative use of library resources by undergraduate students. Unless otherwise specified, the panelists are members of the English Department of Ball State Teachers College. 3 poems by Edwin Arlington Robinson. Discussing these poems are Professor Jean Andrews, Professor Alfred Marks, and Professor David W. Shepard. Luke Havergal. Go to the western gate, Luke Havergal, there where the vines cling crimson on the wall, and in the twilight wait for what will come. The leaves will whisper there of her, and some, like flying words, will strike you as they fall. But go, and if you listen, she will call. Go to the western gate, Luke Havergal, Luke Havergal. No, there is not a dawn in eastern skies to rift the fiery night that's in your eyes. But there, where western glooms are gathering, the dark will end the dark, if anything. God slays himself with every leaf that flies, and hell is more than half of paradise. No, there is not a dawn in eastern skies, Out of a grave I come to tell you this. Out of a grave I come to quench the kiss that flames upon your forehead with a glow that blinds you to the way that you must go. Yes, there is yet one way to where she is, bitter, but one that faith may never miss. Out of a grave I come to tell you this. There's the western gate, Luke Havergal. There are the crimson leaves upon the wall. Go, for the winds are tearing them away, nor think to riddle the dead words they say, nor any more to feel them as they fall. But go, and if you trust her, she will call. There's the western gate, Luke Havergal, Luke Havergal. I suppose one of the first questions that might arise in the reading of this poem is, what is the western gate? Dr. Andrews?
Well, I think here we have the direction west used in a sense, in a symbolic sense in which it is quite commonly employed. I think ordinarily the east is associated with the sunrise and consequently with birth and with light, and west is associated with the sunset and consequently with darkness and with death. I think here the speaker of the poem, whoever he may be, is directing Luke Havergal to go to the western gate, which here is symbolic of death. Would you agree, Dr. Marks?
Yes, I think that the imagery of the poem certainly supports this interpretation, that this is both death and the west that is being referred to. We have in the second line the words, there where the vines cling crimson on the wall. We have the meaning of the sun going down in the west, and we have the general meaning, the general symbolism of the autumn as being the period during which the year dies, and the same kind of symbolism that we do in the flight of geese, the meaning of the approaching death and the death of the old year.
Don't you think also that the crimson leaves suggest blood here?
Yes, they certainly do.
Well, as long as we're being consistent with the metaphor, many leaves are crimson in the fall. It might be nothing more than that. Simply an extension of the autumn imagery.
Well, I certainly think there is that idea there. I think that crimson leaves also have these other connotations, especially when we see that the leaves seem to be employed symbolically farther on in this same stanza.
Well, the crimson and the fiery imagery is followed here.
Yes, there's also the symbolism of the gate, too. A gate is something that one goes out of. Presumably, Luke Havergal is in this city and is going to this particular place from which people issue out. And this is on the western side. We see that there is twilight imagery, red blood imagery, autumnal imagery. All of these seem to add up, even this early, to a sense of foreboding and of death.
One other question that may arise in this first stanza, and I'll try to state it as clearly as I can. To whom does the pronoun her refer? Are we entitled to ask that yet, or?
I think we may be entitled to ask the question, but we're not entitled yet to draw any very definite conclusion. I think that it's interesting that at this point in our reading of the poem, we don't know who is speaking, nor do we know who the woman alluded to here is. We learn by reading farther into the poem a little more precisely who the speaker is and who the woman is, more precisely, I think, in the third stanza, for instance.
It seems to be pretty definite, however, though, in the beginning of the story, that Luke Havergal is grieving for some woman whom he would like to meet again. This perhaps gives us the ability to think of this as being a story in which we have a lover who has lost his love. We could also look into the name Havergal and think that for a second there, that the gall part of the word is being emphasized to show the bitterness of the life of Luke Havergal. We can also take a completely colloquial interpretation of it and think that it might mean have a gal, and that in this way Luke is a kind of universal lover.
Don't you think that in the fourth and fifth stanzas, the leaves, which we've already mentioned, are used in such a fashion that they we strongly find the suggestion that they are being used symbolically. The leaves will whisper there of her, and some, like flying words, will strike you as they fall. Although I think this is a curious metaphor, because ordinarily in poetry we find that that a metaphor is employed in order to clear up an abstraction. That is, a poet expresses an abstract idea and attempts to clear up the idea, to cast greater light on it, by introducing a concrete comparison. The abstract is compared to the concrete in order to make the abstract more clear. Here we have the leaves, the physical, tangible objects, will fall and strike Luke Havergal like flying words, which are the intangible objects. And I think this curious little reversal gives more importance to the metaphor. That is, why has he said that the leaves are like flying words? This really doesn't tell us any more about the way that the leaves fall at all. It does tend to identify the leaves symbolically, I think, with flying words, harsh words, so that I'm inclined to believe that somewhere or another in the relationship of Luke Havergal and this woman who is apparently gone, there has been a quarrel of some sort. Do you think this is a justifiable interpretation?
Well, I think it may be a justifiable interpretation. And again, it's rather early to draw any sweeping conclusions, but my subjective impression of much of Robinson's poetry is this, that he describes mysteries. He does not unravel them. when he brings in these metaphors, they do not necessarily clear up the mystery. And I think we can cite this from any number of, well, we don't know why Richard Cory shot himself, we only know that he did. The same thing is true of many of the other characters in Tilbury Town. But I think that apparently there has been some conflict here in the past. That may be part of the source of the grief.
Yes, I see no other possible function for the simile here except to associate the falling of the leaves with words, because, as I previously said, to compare the falling leaves to words certainly doesn't tell us any more about the leaves in an objective sense, at least.
I think, however, that these words are going to become more meaningful in the last stanza. This use of the metaphor of words for the leaves, I think that all we need to think of here is that there is something quite meaningful about the leaves, and I think that he is only meaning to underscore the symbolism that we have already talked about. The leaves become the symbols of death, of fall. And he is saying, if you go out to the western gate, there the leaves that are falling will tell you of death. And they will strike you like so many flying words as they fall, and will simply tell you of the omnipotence of death and of the fact that you will never find the person whom you are looking for, and she will never call to you save by way of death.
This imagery is pursued in the second stanza, no dawn in eastern skies. Then we get the rift the fiery night that's in your eyes. And we get, apparently, Luke is the victim of a burning passion of some kind. The question is he on the verge of madness?
Well, of course, I think the use of the adjective fiery suggests that this is a stormy night, a tumultuous night, a night that is characterized by flashing lightning and perhaps even the glare of meteors and so on.
When I think of fiery night, I think of a imagery symbolizing hell.
I think it's very important that we at least look at the idea that you brought up, Dr. Shepard. For some reason or other, writers like to deal with heroes who are practically mad. Hamlet, of course, Vincent van Gogh, also familiar. However, it is also important that while the implication is that the man is close to mad, it is nevertheless the essential sanity of the man that makes for the interest of the story, and that makes for the fact that the story can go on any sane level at all. So I think it is important to us to see that Luke Havergal is distraught, but sane.
I think it's also an interesting point that here the significance of the imagery has changed a bit. We still have the eastern-western imagery. In the first line, there is not a dawn in eastern skies. I think here the east is being used as a symbol of hope, which is a fairly common symbol of the east. Again, the rising sun. But there is no hope to destroy the fiery night that's in your eyes, and here the night seems to be symbolic of despair, don't you think?
Well, it also means here, I think, eastern skies, I think, means that nothing new will be born into this world that will take your mind off the love whom you have lost. She will not be reborn in life at any time. You will not find the love that you seek in any other woman. The only way that you will find your love again is through death.
Note how he plays that off in this second stanza. No light to bring you hope or to rid you of this passion. But if you go to the west, the dark will end the dark. No light, but dark will end the dark.
Yes.
And we got this God slays himself with every leaf that flies, and hell is more than half of paradise. I'm afraid there the metaphor may be a little bit more obscure than it was when we began.
Going back to the dark ending the dark, again, I think we have the term dark being used with a double symbolic significance. The first dark is symbolic of death, and I think the second dark is symbolic of despair. In other words, the darkness of death will end the darkness of your despair, if anything.
I think also here we have the turn to the west. There will be no more sunrise for you in the east. It is to the west that you must turn to receive light, for light to be thrown on the fiery night that is in your eyes. And then we are given the problem. Well, how can one find light in the west when the west brings only darkness? Well, we then are thrown almost directly into the thought of Christianity at Easter time, in the thought of resurrection and the way in which resurrection can bring life and light to the world. I was sitting in church about a year ago when I noticed a few words from similar to the Luke Havergal words in the scripture that was being read on that day. I think the words were the last four words of the third stanza. To tell you this, I think the words that I heard were, I tell you this. And the words were concerned with the meaning of the resurrection in Christianity, the way in which through death life came to Christians. I then just happened to notice that the passage that we were reading was from Luke. And it just happened on that particular day that the hymn that we sang was by a Francis Ridley Havergal, a 19th century hymn writer. This may seem to be the mystical approach to literary criticism. Just go to church and wait for it, and the idea will come drifting down to you from the ceiling of the nave. At any rate, I think that the meaning of resurrection is important here, and it underlies then the words, God slays himself with every leaf that flies, because we do have, in a sense, God slaying himself in the Easter ritual.
It seems very strange that in our discussions of poetry, many times we stumble into discussions of theology. Still wondering about this hell is more than half of paradise. Have we cleared this up?
And this is the problem of the same pair of paradoxes, or the same paradox that we have seen before. Death becomes, in this poem, half of life. And in the same way, the pains of the world become very important to paradise. And so, to Luke Havergal, only as you know pain, only as you know death, only as you know terror, will you ever begin to know reunion and love and eternal felicity with the one whom you love.
Interesting idea. I think we You find the same thing expressed in Marlowe's Faust. Mephistopheles is talking with Dr. Faustus. Dr. Faustus is questioning Mephistopheles, where is hell? And Mephistopheles replies, well, this is hell, and I'm not out of it. There's no distinction between the world in which Dr. Faustus lives and hell. Becomes sometimes, apparently, Marlowe's implying it's a matter of attitude. And perhaps there's the implication here that Luke has made his own hell.
Well, of course, this reminds one of Paradise Lost, too, Satan's line, myself am hell. I wonder if the relevance of this passage, though, isn't this. In effect, the speaker, whoever he may be, and we don't know for certain who he is yet, but the speaker has been counseling Luke Havergal to take his own life. Now, there are certain theological objections, of course, to suicide. Now, hasn't the speaker, in these lines, God slays himself with every leaf that flies, hasn't he attempted to rationalize his position, to justify suicide to Luke Havergal by pointing out to him that suicide is a practice which is sanctioned even by God, because with every fall of a leaf in autumn, God is in a sense destroying himself. At least he is destroying a part of nature which is a manifestation of himself.
With all due respect to your interpretation, Dr. Andrews, I don't think the person who is speaking is advising Luke to commit suicide. I think he is telling him that the answer to your problem is death. He is trying to adjust Luke to death. There's really nothing wrong with it.
This is a
perpetuation of the current state of affairs, perhaps, but there you will find the person for whom you were looking.
This is a basic problem of otherworldly Christianity, which holds that only in some life apart from this vale of tears will one find happiness. It tends to preach, then, that only in death will one find what is meaningful in the universe. At the same time, it tends to preach against suicide. So actually, I think, Dr. Andrews, you are finding the dilemma here, but I don't think that suicide itself is definitely stated.
No, I wouldn't say it's definitely stated. What he's telling him is that go to the western gate, which implies an effort of the will, in order to find the woman that you seek. Go to death in order to find the woman that you seek.
Now the third stanza begins, out of a grave I come to tell you this, out of a grave I come to quench the kiss that flames upon your forehead with a glow that blinds you to the way that you must go. The I, then, seems to be the person who is addressing Luke Havergal in this poem. It doesn't seem that this I is the woman whom he is longing for, because she is mentioned in the fifth line. Yes, there is yet one way to where she is, but all we can say about this voice is that it is a voice, a kind of ghost that comes to Luke Havergal from beyond the grave and gives him advice.
I would like to defend the point that it may be the woman who is talking, and she's referring to herself in the third person. It certainly introduces some rather interesting complications if we take that interpretation.
Well, now I can think of only one other poem in which a person refers to himself both in the first person and in the third person within the same stanza, and that is Caliban upon Cetobos, where Caliban, this very primitive creature, does refer to himself occasionally as I and occasionally as he. I wonder whether the very fact that The speaker refers to himself as I in the first two lines, though, and then refers to she in the fifth line, doesn't indicate that two different persons are indicated here.
Of course, there is no reason why a disembodied spirit cannot both think of its own essence that is somewhere in heaven, and also of itself as being the somewhat worldly ghost of itself too. It's something like the problem that we have in Prometheus Unbound, in which Zeus goes to Hades and finds his own ghost, the phantasm, as it were. It does bring up the problem of the phantasm that exists in Hades even while the person is alive on earth. I don't know that we can do too much with the problem. I think, however, that we can say that if we work hard, we might be able to get the I and the she to be the same person, but that if we don't want to do it, we don't necessarily have to do it.
I simply see no evidence that the I and the she are the same person. I don't see any reason for reaching such a conclusion. In the other poems that we've mentioned that pose the same problem, there is strong collateral evidence that indicates that I and she refer to the same person. But in this particular poem, lacking further evidence, I think we should assume the obvious, namely that these are two different people.
We notice then that the I, who has come from the grave, has taken upon itself the burden of disillusioning Luke Havergal with life and with the hope of ever finding in life the love he seeks. He is too much caught up with the world and with physical love for the person who is gone. And somehow the kiss that she left upon his forehead is burning him in such a way that he is blinded to the way that he must go. So this I then feels that he must give Luke the understanding that in no physical love will he find what he wants, and that not at all in life, but only through death, will he ever find the way that he must travel. So he says, yes, there is yet one way to where she is, bitter, but one that faith may never miss. And we are now back to the problem, perhaps, of the Christian notion of the resurrection, although possibly not. Faith doesn't have to mean that much. Then finally, out of the grave I come to tell you this, and we wonder again how close this comes to resurrection symbolism.
I think there's also the possibility that the speaker of this poem may be simply a voice that Luke Havergal hears. We've already had the suggestion that Luke Havergal is a half-crazed man, a man half-crazed with grief. Is this a voice which he hears, which seems to tell him that the only way that he can rejoin his loved one is through death? And I'd like to come back to the suggestion that Luke may be feeling here the temptation to commit suicide. The path to where she is a bitter one, but it's the only path by which he can rejoin his loved one.
The final stanza brings in another, perhaps a minor problem. The restatement there is the western gate, again the leaf imagery. Nor think to riddle the dead words, they say, I feel brings up something of a problem. But what about the sixth line of the stanza? If you trust her, she will call. Does this mean that at some time in the past, Luke did not trust this woman. There was some conflict between them. I think we mentioned this matter of conflict before. Is that one of the sources of this fixation of his?
It seems to bring up a more complex problem. We had the words in the last stanza, but one that faith may never miss. Therefore, he can find what he wants somehow through faith. But he is told, the leaves are striking you now. Don't think to riddle the dead words they say. They do not give you the specific answer you are looking for. You must look away from these worldly things and turn to the way of faith in her and faith in her ghosts. Therefore, you will only be able again to have her as you have faith in the meaning of death as bringing about a kind of mystical rebirth and a reunion of all lovers.
I have one final comment to add by way of summary, and that is that although we have not worked out precisely in detail the one meaning of this poem, we do find that we have reached at least an area of agreement, that there are certain basic facts in this situation that all of us seem to agree on, namely that Luke Havergal is a man who is mourning the loss of a loved one, that some spirit or some voice is counseling him that death is the only way in which he can achieve a reunion with his loved one.
Credo. I cannot find my way. There is no star in all the shrouded heavens anywhere, and there is not a whisper in the air of any living voice but one so far that I can hear it only as a bar of lost imperial music, played when fair and angel fingers wove, and unaware, dead leaves to garlands where no roses are. No, there is not a glimmer nor a call, for one that welcomes when he fears the black and awful chaos of the night. For through it all, above, beyond it all, I know the far-sent message of the years. I feel the coming glory of the light. Now, our first problem is, of course, the title. What does this mean in Latin, Mr. Andrews?
I think that this is the Latin verb, credo, credere. The credo form means I believe. Of course, the term is used in English quite commonly to mean simply a statement of faith, a system of rules by which a man lives.
I'm interested in the imagery we got here in the beginning of the poem, this statement of belief. It says he cannot find his way, that in this world he is completely lost, with the exception of one thing, and that is this very distant sound, or this very distant whisper, which he hears as a bar of lost imperial music. Though he may be lost as far as his vision is concerned, he does hear something. Well, apparently there is something in the misery of this world that gives him something to believe.
Yes, and he does a very neat job of showing just how infinitesimal this hint is. At first it becomes like a bar of lost imperial music, like perhaps a remembered lost chord. And it becomes then that this music is played, or was played, when fair and angel fingers wove, dead leaves to garlands where no roses are, that in this very delicate operation of angel fingers weaving garlands from dead leaves of which the roses are long dead, the music of this ghostly operation is all the ghost of a sound that he has for something meaningful in the world.
Dr. Andrews, do you feel that this "and unaware" is a misplaced modifier for the sake of a rhyme scheme? Are the fingers unaware that they wove, or what does that mean?
Yes, syntactically, the sentence is not very logical. The angel fingers appear to be the expression that unaware modifies, although logically, of course, I suppose the unaware would have to modify not the fingers, but the angel itself. And the angel in this sentence is functioning as an adjective, so that as far as I can see, the structure of this sentence is a little loose.
I'll admit that this does make for difficulties, this word unaware thrown in here, actually interpolated here. And Robinson does this fairly often, but I don't see it as a defect in the poem, and I see it as an attempt of his to express something that is very difficult to express. And that is to express this, as I said before, extremely delicate operation of these angel fingers weaving these mysteriously evanescent, almost non-existing garlands, and I think it intensifies his meaning by his saying that they are doing it almost unaware that they are doing it.
Yes, I have no objection to the image itself. I think that we should point out, however, that there are some grammatical irregularities in this line. For instance, the expression "and unaware." What does the coordinate conjunction "and" connect here? It connects two different parts of speech, which is a fundamental violation of the usual principles of sentence structure. And we also have in the last line, dead leaves to garlands where no roses are. The clause "where no roses are" would be considered misplaced according to the ordinary rules of sentence structure, since it's widely separated from the word that it modifies, wove.
One thing I'd like to say in Robinson's defense, perhaps, and that is that the rules of syntax apply to statements of fact. Here we have the poet dealing with metaphors, and there are things that he must do. He cannot honor both God and Caesar, so in this instance he has to honor Caesar, perhaps, and, poetic license.
Yes,
there's charitable things to be said for it.
I think I seldom object to some of the syntactical irregularities of E. Cummings, for instance, when it becomes clear that Cummings has violated the ordinary rules of sentence structure or grammar for a specific purpose. In this particular instance, however, the sentence strikes me as being rather awkward, and I can't see what special effect he gains by using these modifiers in what would ordinarily be considered an awkward position.
I see, however, the "and" as meaning here at that, unaware. So it does become, the "and unaware" becomes a somewhat colloquial expression that is thrown in here, but I think if we notice that in the line, "and angel fingers wove and unaware," that it enables us to move through the line perfectly, rhythmically, that there is not a bit of difficulty metrically in saying this, and that there might be other ways that he could say it, but certainly this is one of the smoothest.
His reference to lost imperial music as symbolic of the hint of another greater power reminds me of Wordsworth's Ode on Intimations of Immortality. It's interesting to see the images that the two men chose. Wordsworth speaks, of course, of a splendor, of a glitter, which is almost completely faded away as he grows older, and Robinson's image is that of a beautiful melody, which has almost completely faded away.
The theology of this poem is rather interesting. I think I'll go out on a limb, so to speak, and I think that in this statement of faith, Robinson paints a rather gloomy picture of this world, and when we get into this last stanza, there's not a glimmer, there's nothing in this world which justifies his belief, but nevertheless he believes it.
Yes, and he says that even those who welcome death only welcome it because they fear it. And because they fear it, they feel they have nothing to lose by acting as if they welcome it, as if it is pleasant to them, almost out of fear, like a child fearing a policeman, let us say, and therefore acting nice to him. These people act as if they welcome death, even while they fear it.
I'm not sure that I get exactly that same meaning. He doesn't say that they welcome death, that he welcomes death because he fears it. He says that he welcomes it, although he welcomes it and at the same time fears it, I think. I think that it's perfectly possible to fear an experience and at the same time to welcome it. We fear it because perhaps it is unknown, and yet we welcome it because we think that it will bring us something that we want.
Well, I think that we're probably in essential agreement here. At the risk of belaboring this line, it says that for one who welcomes death, welcomes it even though he fears it, welcomes this black and awful chaos of death, person welcomes it, yet there is not one shred of evidence in this world to justify that welcoming. But even so, above and beyond it, he knows the far-sent message of the years, and he feels the coming glory of the light. He has no concrete evidence for it here, but it's this subjective, he feels it.
I don't feel that Robinson is saying here that he is welcoming the black and awful chaos of the night. I think he implies that other people welcome it, and that the only reason they have to welcome it is this. I don't, however, feel that he wants to be placed in this category of one who welcomes death because it is something that he fears. He does, however, say that there is some glory of the light coming. We have in the poem, then, an interesting problem of Robinson's belief, and we see, importantly, that he gives it the name Credo. This was written, of course, in the days before Edward R. Murrow, but this is Edwin Arlington Robinson's, This I Believe, and he tells us that he believes in spite of the fact that he has absolutely no reason to believe. Then, to make it a completely Robinsonian poem, if you'll excuse my using that adjective, he spends most of his time not talking about the positive things that he thinks exist outside this world, but he spends his time discussing the black and awful chaos of the night, the lack of evidence there is in this world for this, and only in the last 3 lines of the poem does he permit it to open itself out at all into any statement of belief, which then, of course, is an extremely vague statement of what lies beyond this world.
3 poems by Edwin Arlington Robinson. Discussing these poems are Professor Jean Andrews, Professor Alfred Marks, and Professor David W. Shepard.
Eros, turannos. She fears him and will always ask what fated her to choose him. She meets in his engaging mask all reasons to refuse him. But what she meets and what she fears are less than are the downward years drawn slowly to the foamless weirs of age were she to lose him. Between a blurred sagacity that once had power to sound him, and love that will not let him be the Judas that she found him, her pride assuages her almost, as if it were alone the cost. He sees that he will not be lost, and waits and looks around him. A sense of ocean and old trees envelops and allures him. Tradition, touching all he sees, beguiles and reassures him. And all her doubts of what he says are dimmed with what she knows of days, till even prejudice delays and fades, and she secures him. The falling leaf inaugurates the reign of her confusion. The pounding wave reverberates the dirge of her illusion. And home, where passion lived and died, becomes a place where she can hide, while all the town and harbor side vibrate with her seclusion. We tell you, tapping on our brows, the story as it should be, as if the story of a house were told or ever could be. We'll have no kindly veil between her visions and those we have seen, as if we guessed what hers have been, or what they are or would be. Meanwhile, we do no harm, for they that with a God have striven, not hearing much of what we say, take what the God has given, though like waves breaking it may be, or like a changed familiar tree, or like a stairway to the sea, where down the blind are driven.
I think we might begin our discussion of this poem by considering the title. It seems that Robinson employs some significance in the titles of these poems, and how can this Eros turannos be translated?
We can look at it as the tyrannical God of love, or if we wish, the tyranny of love. However, I think that the tyrannical God of love would be a more precise interpretation
Well,
of
that seems to lead us into the first stanza then, where Robinson appears to set the scene, establishes the situation, and apparently she fears him and will always ask what fated her to choose him. She fears him and she can't understand why she chose this man to be her husband. Now, I am assuming that at this point in the poem, Robinson is describing a man and wife relationship. What fated her to choose him puts it clearly in the past tense. And even though she has chosen him, she still sees in his engaging mask, that is, his suave smile, perhaps his handsome face, she still sees in that engaging quality a number of reasons as to why she should have said no. Immediately we have a conflict set up here. Man and wife in conflict.
Now, although Robinson tells us in the opening 4 lines of this poem that she cannot understand why she chose him, I think in the concluding lines of the poem, of this stanza rather, Robinson tells us exactly why she did choose him. Don't you think so, Dr. Marks?
Yes, he says here, but what she meets and what she fears are less than are the downward years drawn slowly to the foamless weirs of age were she to lose him. And this does not exactly help us to resolve the problem of whether she has yet married the man or not. I would just as soon see it here as being and describing a period of courtship. She fears the man whom she meets. She wonders why she has ever begun to have anything to do with him. I wouldn't like to take the word choose as meaning much more than that at this time. The more she looks at him, at his engaging mask, and in this respect I simply like to think of the man here, this interloper into the New England scene, as being something like A.B. the drummer in the fancy vest, whose engaging mask makes him a very good-looking man, but it is a mask. It masks the man that is behind it.
Well, it reminds me a little bit of Henry James' Washington Square, where the girl meets this engaging young bounder, and because she thinks that no one else will ever marry her, she grasps at straws. She wants to marry him.
Yes.
A similar situation here.
And I hadn't really yet answered Dr. Andrews' question, because in the last 4 lines we see that the meeting his engaging mask, but what she meets refers to his engaging mask, and what she fears, in spite of the fact that she fears the things that are in this man, somehow these things are less than is the fear of the downward years and of the years descending into age, which move slowly toward these foamless weirs of age, referring again to the water going over the dam and the weirs at the top of the dam, the comb-like devices that catch the debris going over the dam, in which the lost and the dead are caught. And her fears of age and living alone are much worse than these fears of this man whom she might marry by mistake.
Rather interesting philosophy here. Apparently, at this point, the woman feels it's better to be married badly than not to be married at all.
Yes.
I was interested in your reference to New England. How do you know that this poem has its setting in New England? Is there anything in the poem itself which leads you to reach this conclusion?
On the one hand, of course, we have a New England poet here. This doesn't necessarily mean that he is going to write about New England locale. But although New England poets very commonly do, but we do have in the 3rd stanza the word ocean, where her home seems to be near the ocean, and then we see that they take up their abode in a town which is by the harbor side. And since he is a New England poet, and he is writing about some ocean locale, I don't see any reason why we can't begin to think that this is New England locale. Most of Robinson's locales are New England.
One question I have, is this one of the poems from the Tilbury Town collection? Might be a partial answer.
Yes, it may be.
The next stanza, I think, begins to investigate in more detail the reasons why the woman of the poem accepted this man in spite of the faults that she saw within him. Between a blurred sagacity that once had power to sound him and love that will not let him be the Judas that she found him, her pride assuages her almost, as if it were alone the cost. Apparently, at one time, this woman was able to sound this man. The metaphor, of course, is drawn from a seafaring practice. That is, she was able to determine his depths, or to employ still another metaphor, to see through him. But between this sagacity that at one time empowered her to see through him and her present state, where love will not let her see him as the Judas that he actually is, she finds herself in between these two extremes.
We have then here a period of time between their first meeting and their marriage. We have described here the courtship days. And at first, when she met him, she had the power to sound him. She also had the ability to see him as a Judas. But then she falls in love with him, and her sagacity becomes blurred.
I think there are two things that might be emphasized here. Judas, the betrayer, and second, note what Robinson tells us about the man. He sees that he will not be lost and waits and looks around him. He sees that the way is clear, and that no matter what happens, no matter what he does, at this point, he has caught her. So that, simply the way is clear. He's found a good marriage, and he's going to take advantage of it.
And to recur to the drummer in the fancy vest characterization, he now decides that he can case the joint and look about at the kind of things that he might gain ownership of if he marries her.
Yes, there's one other interesting line, I think, that perhaps demands some explication. Her pride assuages her almost, as if it were alone the cost. A rather puzzling line, because I think in one respect at least, the words do not mean exactly what they say. It's not her pride that assuages her, as I see it. It is her belief that she has lost only her pride that assuages her. She has lost far more than just her sense of pride by loving this man. Again, I find that the line is a little awkward. Her pride assuages her almost.
There is a division, actually, of the word pride. The first line says, the pride that will not let her let herself become an old maid assuages her, makes her feel that somehow she is better off. Also, however, she has sacrificed her pride. So we have in these two lines, as you stated, another paradox stated. She is proud because she was able to sacrifice her pride in marrying this man, or in deciding that she might marry this man beneath her station, in order to maintain the pride of family, which is the higher in a woman who has managed to find an acceptable mate.
I wonder if we might move on to the third stanza. Here we have a description of what he sees, and again, of course, we find out much more about the man's character. He sees a sense of ocean and old trees. Rather, a sense of ocean and old trees envelops and allures him, so that he too is beguiled, in a sense, by the surroundings. Apparently, a good life lures him on, that he may not be in love with her, and I think that is an important clue here. Tradition touches all he sees, that again beguiles him, so that he is, in a sense, seduced by this old, respectable family into which he is marrying. Perhaps I would assume that he will be reasonably well off financially.
I think also that the mention of the word tradition probably supports Dr. Marks' conclusion that the setting here is in New England, together with the mention of the ocean and the harbor and so on.
Then, in the fifth line, we have a fairly careful movement from the first four lines in which he is somehow beguiled and reassured by what he sees. Then somehow he seems to be able to make his own words more convincing. And so all her doubts of what he says are dimmed with what she knows of days. And we have the same reference back to the first stanza, to her fear of living alone, till even prejudice delays and fades, and she secures him. This is the first time that we have introduced into this the notion that she understands that this man is of a lower class than she, but perhaps this is what is meant by the word prejudice, that somehow delays here, and by delays it seems to mean that prejudice does not hurry, does not take the foreground so that it can take control of her, and it fades, and finally she secures him, and there's a little doubt as to who secures whom here.
I find Dr. Marks' references to this man as a man of a lower class rather interesting, and I think the only thing we may conclude at this time is that the man is undoubtedly a complete cad, a bounder. Perhaps he is impecunious, but being of a lower class, I'm not sure that Robinson is too concerned with classes. He's concerned here with the relationship between these two. Neither of them, obviously, quite match the other. Both are guilty of some deception. She obviously is saying that she loves him, and she doesn't love him, she loves marriage. He's saying that he says that he loves her. He doesn't love her. He loves her money, he loves the tradition, he loves the prospects of living a life of ease and comfort, plus the ability to, well, obviously he has no intention of being faithful to her, or at least not for very long.
Yes, undoubtedly, my conclusion that he is of a lower class is founded on very little evidence. The only evidence that it has is the word tradition, which beguiles and reassures him, meaning that he is not of a heritage that knows tradition, therefore he envies it here. And second, the word prejudice, in which I am trying to read a sense of class prejudice.
Well, perhaps the class prejudice in the sense of the social climber. I may be misconstruing what you mean by class.
Yes, I'm willing to, if you grant that there is the implication of social climber, you have gone as far as I wish to go. Our fourth stanza, then, gives us the period after the marriage.
Yes, we have here introduced for the first time, I think, our pathetic fallacy. And rather interestingly, we find the falling leaf here that we've already discovered in Luke Havergal. The falling leaf inaugurates the reign of her confusion. That is, the falling of the leaves are to be equated with her disillusionment upon learning that her husband is perhaps as bad as she suspected that he might be. The pounding wave reverberates the dirge of her illusion. Again, of course, this is a poetic fancy. It seems to her that the pounding of the waves on the seashore served as a sort of death knell to the illusions that she perhaps fondly had cherished about her husband.
Just dawned on me, gentlemen, we have a poem here which might very well be illustrated by the Hogarth paintings, the series of the marriage a la mode. The honeymoon is over, and the marriage is on the rocks. Though in this instance the wife stays home while the husband is out cavorting.
Yes, we have here, though, I think actually the reverse side of the Hogarth painting, the part of it that he didn't do, the home part. I see, however, that in the first and third lines of this stanza, the falling leaf and the pounding wave, that these are metaphors, and that the falling leaf seems to show the onset of age, that this is a period of time perhaps after her youth is gone, and that the pounding wave again has the sense of time passing and uses the symbolism of the ocean in which we have the ebb and flood of time.
Well, apparently the only thing that these two had in common was some physical attraction, and when that has burned out, they have nothing in common anymore.
Yes.
And the marriage may be there in fact, but in a sense there is no marriage at all.
It's interesting also to see that Robinson has chosen his metaphors from the setting of the about which he's writing. We discovered in the love song of J. Alfred Prufrock that Eliot, for instance, draws most of his metaphors from the tea table. He speaks of tea and cakes and ices and measuring out one's life in coffee spoons. And here Robinson draws his images from the New England countryside, the pounding of the wave, the falling of the leaf, and so on.
Seems to be a rather interesting small-town expose here, that the woman goes into seclusion, becomes a recluse. Apparently she no longer moves through the town or with any social circle, and I suppose we may assume that her husband is out behaving rather badly, and while all of this is going on, she's become something of an object of gossip. I suppose we could all pick up such examples from our own hometowns.
Yes, the explicit references to small-town gossip come out particularly strongly in the next stanza. In this stanza, however, we concentrate on the house itself. And here the house is described as the place where passion lived and died. The imagery is consistent. We were told in the line before this about the dirge of her illusion. The pounding wave is sounding the death knell of these illusions of hers, this illusion about love that is dying a natural death, or perhaps an unnatural death, in the house. And the house then moves from being a kind of home of death to a place that hides her as she stays here within it in a kind of exaggerated mourning over the loss of love. And at the same time, all the town and harbor side vibrate with her seclusion. They are filled with the stories about what has happened inside the house.
I think one thing that may be said to Robinson's credit is that he is always on the periphery of scandal. He is not a gossip poet. He may mention small-town gossip, yet he does not get into the gossip. He does not really tell us what the problem is between these two. I suppose that he gives us as much in the early part of the poem as anyone might have honestly discovered. And from there on, we're on the outside, we're on the surface. We never do discover what the real relationship was between these two. I think it takes a poet of considerable skill to avoid the temptation that is held up by the Peyton Place approach to small-town life.
I think also
on gossip, yet he does not get into the gossip. He does not really tell us what the problem is between these two. I suppose that he gives us as much in the early part of the poem as anyone might have honestly discovered. And from there on, we're on the outside, we're on the surface. We never do discover what the real relationship was between these two. I think it takes a poet of considerable skill to avoid the temptation that is held up by the Peyton Place approach to small-town life.
I think also we see that in the next stanza, the fifth stanza, that Robinson here employs a trick that seems to be one of his favorite devices. He recognizes the fact that an outsider may draw certain conclusions about the nature of human relations between two people, but that he seldom has the whole story. We tell you, tapping on our brows, the story as it should be, as if the story of a house were told or ever could be. That is, he's saying here, in effect, that it is impossible for an outsider ever really to know the complete story of a house.
At this point, we get a rather avant-garde touch, I feel. It brings to mind the Italian playwright Pirandello, who frequently sets up similar situations in plays. He goes ahead and supplies the gossip, both sides. But by the conclusion of the play, we don't know what the situation is. Yes, she's my mother-in-law. No, she is not.
The words, we tell you, tapping on our brows, reinforce what I've said before about New England. We very commonly see in fiction two New England old maids from the time, I suppose the tradition of the New England old maid comes from the time when too many young men of New England were listening to Horace Greeley and going west and leaving their generation of young women behind unmarried. But the tradition is a frequently employed one of having these two old maids get together and gossip about other people, and particularly tapping on their brows and telling about what is wrong with some one person in the town. I still recall the term pixelated being used in some such connection. And we have it here then. The rest of the town taps on their brows about what is wrong with this woman inside the house.
In the concluding lines of the fifth stanza, we'll have no kindly veil between her visions and those we have seen, as if we guessed what hers have been or what they are or would be. I think he's, in a sense, repeating what he's already said. He starts off by saying that he refuses to romanticize the relationship between this man and woman. He's not going to give only a romanticized version of their relationship. She has her visions of of the ideal married life, but on the other hand, we have seen what we have seen, implying that the husband has not been a model husband. But then again, he reminds us that, rather apologetically, that we really have no way of knowing what her visions were or what they are.
Well, I see that point quite well. I'm glad you made it, because he does as if we guessed what hers has been. In other words, as if we had guessed at the right answer. It's the anti-gossip approach. A person who sees a situation and immediately starts reading quite a bit into it and assumes that, well, this is the situation as it exists, and we go on from there.
And also, he is not going to tell any pretty story about what happened, and he is also not going to tell any story that might justify her as against her husband. He simply avoids telling the story. He avoids hanging this kindly veil between what happened and what might have happened.
Of course, in the last stanza, he expands on this, that even with what we have said about them, what little we have said, that does no harm, because these two have been occupied with their own problems. They probably haven't heard much about it anyway.
And also, for they that with a God have striven, not hearing much of what we say, take what the God has given. And in his last lines, he is trying to show that these two people involved in a kind of drama of love are in the grasp of Eros and are involved in a kind of cosmic drama. And for these cosmic actors and against these cosmic actors, no picayune gossip can do damage.
Yes, this concluding stanza reminds me a bit of Galsworthy's short story, The Apple Tree, in which we have the same basic conceit, I suppose. That is, those who become involved in love also have to take the punishment that love metes out. Now, of course, the situation certainly is not identical in the two works. But here, once again, I think he's saying that a person who becomes involved in love, who strives with Eros, has to be prepared to take what little happiness the God sees fit to give him. And I think that the implication here pretty clearly is that although the woman's lot appears to be an unhappy one, she was lucky to get as much love as she managed to obtain before unhappiness struck her.
Well, that may be the case, Dr. Andrews, but that what God has given them, Robinson explains what that may be. What God gives them may be like waves breaking. It may be like a changed familiar tree. I think we'll have to pursue that metaphor. Or what this God of love has given them may be like a stairway to the sea where down the blind are driven. We get the vision of, or the picture of the blind and the useless being driven down a stairway to their death.
Yes, the metaphors, however, I think, carry back very interestingly to the metaphors used earlier in the poem. And so that where we have, like waves breaking it may be, we have the reference to the line, the pounding wave reverberates the dirge of her illusion. The changed familiar tree is another tying together with the line about the ocean and old trees, and the stairway to the sea reference, however, only utilizes, I think, that part of the sea imagery which attracted the man originally. But he's saying here that these people are happy to get what the God has given, even though it may be these very unencouraging things that are around the woman as she remains here in the old house in her seclusion, hearing only the waves breaking, seeing only the familiar trees outside the house changing, becoming older, and for all we know, in certain families, perhaps not this one, being cut down because they have Dutch elm disease or something of the sort.
Yes, I think that we must remember that when this woman decided to accept this man for her husband, it was with the idea that any portion of love that she could salvage in her life, almost any kind of marriage that she could achieve would be preferable to an old age of spinsterhood. And in this concluding stanza of the poem, then, what Robinson seems to be telling us is that those who have striven with the God of love do not pay very much attention to the judgments of outsiders, but are prepared to take what the God has given to them. That is, they have accepted their husbands for better or for worse, to quote the phrase that's used in the marriage ceremony. And when Robinson says that the experience may be compared to a changed familiar tree, I think there is the implication here that women seldom really know what their husbands are like until they have married them and lived with them for some time. They may think that they know the young man who is courting them, but they soon discover after marriage that what was a familiar tree undergoes a sort of sea change, and they have to be prepared to accept that husband even if he does change.
When Robinson refers to these people, for they that with the God have striven, I think that may refer to the woman's seclusion. If we go to the Greek poems and the Greek plays, what happened to the characters who struggled with the gods? In many instances, driven mad or transformed into some animal that was tormented. And I think we have that here, that for the price of a brief period of love, of perhaps some physical satisfaction, this is the price she pays.
I wonder also if we don't have a significant progression in these three images. He says that a woman may find that her lot is like waves breaking, that is, it may be torment, it may be simply a changed familiar tree, it may be that the man that she marries turns out to be different in some way from what she expected, and I think the last probably represents the metaphor which is most applicable to this particular woman, or like a stairway to the sea where down the blind are driven. That is, she entered upon this marriage for all practical purposes blind, and she discovers that she has been progressing down a stairway to the sea, which here may be symbolic simply of her seclusion and isolation.